Hi, I'm very excited to welcome all of you to our webinar with the Louisiana Department of Education. We are thrilled to see so many participants. My name is Cedra Spano. I am Director of Partnership Development for TeachStone, and just have a few housekeeping things to go over before we get started. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be shared out via email about 24 hours from now. And also there is a question and answer tab that you all can use to put in any comments or questions that you have for our panel. And we'll do our best to try to get to those either during the webinar or at the very end. We'll try to save time for your questions. So they have a lot to cover. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction, and then I'm going to turn it over to Louisiana DOE to start their presentation. I've had the privilege of working with the Louisiana Department of Education since the beginning of their class journey, which was in, I believe, the 2013-14 school year. So it's been a long-term relationship. I have always been very impressed with their ability to solve problems like the one that we're going to be presenting on today. And in addition to being really forward-thinking and problem solvers, they've also really done a good job of bringing stakeholders, all stakeholders, into the conversation, which I think everyone tries to do, but I think they do it particularly well. So I'm looking forward to hearing them speak a little bit to that during this presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce, well, right now we have two members of the DOE team. A third will be joining shortly. We have Michael Bach and Taylor Dunn on, and Farishay Perkins will be joining shortly. I'm sure we can all relate. She has a young child who is homesick today, so she's doing her best to get things under control. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much. I'm actually going to let Taylor kick us off, and then I'll sort of like pick up in just a little bit with some bigger details about class. But I think to provide just a little bit of context around the way that we've been using class in Louisiana, it makes a lot of and sort of tee us up for a later conversation around how we navigated COVID. I'm going to toss to Taylor to sort of walk through that.
Great, thank you. Good morning, where we are, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Taylor Dunn. I'm the Deputy Assistant Superintendent of Early Childhood Strategy at the Louisiana Department of Education. So along with my colleagues, some of whom are presenting today and some of whom are not presenting today, we have, like many of you, spent the last year and some change now really thinking about how to support our early childhood field during COVID and ensure that the good work continues to happen, even though it might look slightly different than it has in previous years. So today we're going to share with you just some background on how class is used in Louisiana to kind of ground us in a conversation about that first. Then we're going to shift and spend the majority of the time talking about some key decision points that we made at the state level in conversation with stakeholders in the field in our state during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then we'll save time at the end for some questions and answers. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about how class gets used in Louisiana to begin with. And to ground us in some of our priorities and key goals in Louisiana, I would just start this conversation by saying in January of this year, the LDOE released an updated priorities plan that we call Believe to Achieve, which serves as our agency's roadmap to improving outcomes for all Louisiana children. We are driven by a vision and mission centered on getting the best outcomes for all kids who call Louisiana home. It's our vision that every child can reach their potential, no matter where they're from, how much money their family makes, or where they live. Believe to Achieve, this priorities plan includes 6 critical goals that you see on the slide here that are going to direct our agency's efforts to support school systems and early childhood community networks as we work to achieve our critical goals. We believe that our vision for Louisiana students is ambitious but attainable, and together we believe that these 6 critical goals outline a student's successful progression from birth through graduation. So we are very, very proud to consider ourselves as a Department of Education a birth through post-secondary system that thinks about the experiences kids have from the time they're born all the way to the time they graduate high school and matriculate into college and career. And you'll notice here on the left-hand side that the first of our agency's critical goals is that students enter kindergarten ready. So this is really the goal that guides our early childhood work and strategy in Louisiana. And we believe that measuring and supporting quality improvement in early childhood classrooms using the class tool is absolutely critical to achieving these goals and priorities that you see on this slide. So before I turn it over to Michael to talk through how class is used in our accountability system, I think it's important to give you a little bit of an overview of a timeline for how we got to where we are now. So the system that we have in Louisiana for early childhood is a really locally driven system. So sort of the cornerstone to our early childhood system in Louisiana is our community network model that places a lead agency in every community in the state. And they are really the implementers of our early childhood accountability system, which is focused on class. So here you see a progression from what Cedra mentioned earlier, 2013, 2014, where we launched our first pilot of early childhood community networks, to the following year, where we added 16 additional community network pilots. At that same time, legislation was passed in Louisiana to unify licensing, enrollment, and funding. In 2015, 2016, every community in the state had a community network for early childhood that had a lead agency that was at the helm leading that work locally. And at that point, we also achieved implementation of class statewide. So every publicly funded classroom in the state, at that point, toddler and pre-K classrooms, were observed using the class tool for a learning year. In 2016, 2017, we released practice performance profiles. And then we also aligned all of the supports, funding, tax credits, financial incentives, et cetera, to the class tool and ratings produced with the class tool to support and incentivize quality improvement on class. In 2017, 2018, we released the first performance profiles using the class tool with stakes. So the very first public with stakes performance profiles were released that year on our School and Center Finder website. The following year in 2018, 2019, we continued to release these performance profiles, and we also implemented a mandatory site improvement planning process for any sites scoring below 3.75 on the class tool. In 2019, 2020, we further differentiated our rating system to add a 5th rating category that my colleague will talk a little bit about in a few slides. And by fall 2020, we had fully incorporated infant classrooms into our quality rating system. So now every infant, toddler, and pre-K classroom at a publicly funded site in the state is required to participate in class. And as likely many of you were doing in fall 2020, we were also collaborating with a variety of stakeholders to navigate COVID-19 and to understand how class should be used and how accountability should be rolled out during this pandemic year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike Bach, who will talk us through the next few slides.
Thanks so much, Taylor, and good afternoon, y'all. Well, good morning if you're where we are. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. I think that for this webinar, it probably makes a lot of sense to double click really closely on fall 2020 and how the implementation of Act 3 played out, particularly this year. But I think that in order to really understand a lot of the context that we were navigating, it's helpful to have just a little bit more background on how class observations in Louisiana work in a typical year. Like Taylor said, community networks have really been leading the implementation of Act 3, and one of the major ways that this happens is that they are the primary observers of every publicly funded early childhood classroom in Louisiana. All publicly funded early childhood classrooms are observed twice a year by the local community network lead agency. In a lot of places, this is like a school system or a district, but in other places, there are like geographic-based organizations that sort of manage the class observations for that community network. And in addition to observing classrooms twice, our policy stipulates that community networks shadow score or double score like 10% of those observations, including one for every observer who conducts local community network observations during a year to ensure reliability. We also provide an additional check on observations conducted by community network lead agencies through a contract with the Cecil Picard Center at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. The Picard Center observes about 50% of classrooms in any given semester and make sure to observe one classroom of each age type at each center. And so if a center has, say, 1 infant, 2 toddler, and 3 pre-K classrooms, at a bare minimum, 1 infant, 1 toddler, and 1 pre-K classroom at that site will be observed over the course of the year to make sure that, that there is like a check on local observer reliability. Our policies stipulate that when domain level scores differ for a classroom between local and third-party observers, we replace the domain level scores with third-party scores, but this only happens in about 25% of the domain level results that we capture in any given period. This produces a pretty massive data set. In a typical year, I think in the 2018-2019 year, which was the last sort of like full year of a typical sort of class observations, and before infant was fully incorporated, a variety of these observations resulted in around 15,000 observations across about 6,000 publicly funded classrooms in about 1,500 sites across Louisiana. And this data gets used at a variety of levels. Teacher and site level administrators use this data to set goals and target coaching. Sort of one layer removed from that, childcare resource and referral agencies and community network lead agencies use this data to progress monitor, as well as to target their interventions and supports. At the state level, we use this data for all of those purposes to inform decision makers, from parents to like statewide policymakers. And we have partnerships with national researchers who use this data to contribute to an ongoing national conversation about how we best support teachers and, as a result, kids for later life outcomes and later milestones. We use the class tool as like a major component of the performance profiles we publish that we use to provide information to policymakers and parents and other decision makers at the Department of Education. And we, like I said, a huge piece of the performance profiles that we publish is a class score based on the domains that are relevant for the classrooms at each site. And so we roll up class data from all pre-K, toddler, and infant classrooms at a site into a performance score. And I think this has proved to be really useful because of how well we know class connects to and students experiencing the high quality interactions measured by class sets them up for success on later milestones and later, milestones is a great word that I'm going to stick with there. In addition to, so these class scores inform a performance rating that we publish on a performance profile for each site on website louisianaschools.com if you're interested in checking that out. In addition to a performance rating for each site, we also publish a variety of informational metrics about the use of best practices like teacher training, child-to-teacher ratios, the use of curriculum, and the use of assessments to guide instruction. And together, these things measure the elements that we know are connected with positive child outcomes. They provide a really clear and focused path for sites to improve, and they give families a really easy way to compare options within their communities. And over time, we've engaged with research partners at the University of Virginia to study sort of what the components of our performance profiles, and consistently they found that Louisiana observers are accurate and that kids in high quality classrooms in Louisiana that are characterized by high quality interactions are better positioned for later life outcomes. The ratings that we publish on performance profiles include a performance rating based on class score ranges that can go from excellent to unsatisfactory in the sort of scale that you can see here. And with these ratings, we as Louisiana has tied a variety of incentives and supports, as well as some consequences to class scores. On this incentives front, CCAP bonus payments, as well as the school readiness tax credit that's available to families, providers, as well as businesses that donate to childcare centers, are aligned to performance ratings. On the support front, a variety of stakeholders from like local lead agencies to childcare resource and referral networks offer support. The most important support and perhaps the most intense support we offer for sites is site improvement planning, which is mandated for sites that score below a 3.75 in any year. And then very rarely do we use consequences, but and do we use the consequences that policy stipulates, but programs that score unsatisfactory for 2 years in a 3-year period can lose their Type 3 licensure in Louisiana or their public funding. Over time, the way in which stakeholders have coalesced around class as a use and as a measure of quality has also driven improvements in that quality. And you can see on this slide here that over time, the percent of sites in the unsatisfactory or in the approaching proficient categories have shown like steady decrease, and the percent of sites in high proficient or in the excellent rating categories have steadily increased. I think that one of the other ways in which I really like sort of capturing the change and the growth that's happening and benefiting Louisiana kids is through this graph of performance scores over time. And you can see that there's been steady growth since 2016, 2017, when performance scores were first published in Louisiana, both in overall scores across classrooms, but also in each of the domains. And I think that this really speaks to the fact that underneath each of these trends are classrooms that are making significant gains that we know set kids up best for later milestones. I think we expect that changes between like 0.5 point and 1 point in class scores have meaningful impacts on kids' later outcomes. And so underneath each of these trends is the hard work that teachers are doing to make sure that kids are better positioned year after year for the milestones that they'll face later in their educational careers and then down the road more generally. I also think that one of the things that has animated a lot of our work over since 2016, 2017 has been ensuring that as quality increases, so does the access to this quality. We have seen, I think typically over 90% of our at-risk cohort in Louisiana is served in high quality sites. And a huge priority for us has been ensuring that quality is available to more and more students birth to 3 as in the future years. That sort of dual focus on quality and access, I think it was always on our minds, and then much more so in March 2020 when we began navigating a lot of decisions around how to keep those priorities front and center throughout COVID-19. And to sort of kick off our conversation around the things that were on our mind during this time and the decision points we faced, I'm going to toss over to my colleague Farishay Perkins, who's going to start that conversation. Hey, Farishay.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks so much, Taylor. So yeah, at this point in time, now that we've given some background about the importance of class in Louisiana, I'd also like to talk a little bit about stakeholder buy-in and how this understanding of the class tool really shaped our response to the pandemic. So surveys that the University of Virginia has conducted in multiple parishes, that's the Louisiana word for counties, show that the majority of our teachers as well as our leaders really see the class tool as a tool to improve outcomes and also value the class tool. We know from our surveys that 94% of leaders and 86% of teachers are naming high quality teacher-child interactions as their program priority. And we also know that the majority of leaders and teachers believe that the class tool is a good measure of that quality, 79% of leaders and 71% of teachers.
And furthermore, we see the plurality of leaders and teachers believe that class has led to improvements in teaching at their programs. 65% of our lead teachers and 76% of our site leaders. Broadly speaking, there is a lot of buy-in for the class tool in Louisiana after the unification of the early childhood system. And we see that because of this buy-in and the value of the class tool, that really informed what our response looked like. And so looking now at our core beliefs, what we believe is really, first of all, we see that health and safety for our children, for our teachers, for our directors, for observers, for their families has got to be paramount when we're putting our children in care settings. And yet that core belief is also perhaps in tension with the understanding that even, and maybe especially because of the pandemic, interactions matter, and interactions are mattering more than ever before. And so while on the one hand, we want to keep our children and our communities as safe as possible, we also understand that understanding their interactions and the importance of high quality interactions does not diminish despite the need for increased health and safety measures. So that brings us to our third core belief, is that when we're in these very unique, very first in a lifetime situations, they call for creative solutions. They're going to require data. We have got to look at the data and make decisions that are informed on facts rather than feelings, but they also require engagement with our stakeholders. And this is not the time that we really saw to go it alone. So as we're looking through what those decision points during the pandemic look like, we found ourselves navigating this tension of the collection of class data and then how that class data could be used. So the first point I would say is if or how we collect class data to support our critical goals, should we even collect it? So we received the stay-at-home order and the department paused all observations in spring of 2020. And then that second part of that tension is how do we use that class data? And because of that pause, we ended up providing flexibilities for 2019-2020 performance scores that honored both the improvement that had been made without unduly penalizing people for participating in the public care of children. And so looking then on those decision points during the COVID-19 spring of 2020, I do want to paint a picture of that time. I'm sure you all can close your eyes and remember what it was like to be in March of 2020 and in early April, and how scary and how new things were. So in our spring of 2020, I still remember now being called to that meeting and being told that the governor was going to be shutting down our schools and issuing a stay-at-home order. As a result of that, out of an abundance of caution, we paused all class observations that had been scheduled for the remainder of the school year, even though per the governor's executive order, childcare was not required to close. And then again, due to COVID-19, the way that we approached this was a hold harmless approach for how we would utilize the class data. We wanted to honor those improvements that sites were making, that they had worked really hard to. It didn't seem fair to penalize them. And then also we wanted to ensure that as a result of seeing those improvements and that they would have access to tax credits and bonus payments. Now is a very difficult time financially for the care and education of young children. Childcare across America has been hit very hard. And so we decided that sites with a higher 2019 through 2020 performance score could opt in and receive an updated performance profile based on those results. But for all other sites, the department extended the flexibility to extend their prior performance results for one additional year. And again, this whole harmless approach was in an effort to understand people have been making improvements. At the same time, this is a global crisis, and we do not necessarily have the same data that we have always been accustomed to having during these times. So looking now a little bit past spring into the fall of 2020, I'm going to pass it back to my colleague, Michael Bach, to talk a little bit about what those decisions points looked like after that really tumultuous spring of 2020, and how we started thinking about when and if to resume class observation.
Thanks so much, Farisha. Yeah, I think that as we exited sort of the reaction to the initial COVID pandemic and entered into planning for the 2020-2021 school year, these two questions, right? Like, can we collect class data this year? Is it possible to collect this data in a way that's really responsive to the new circumstances? As well as then, like, if we're able to, how do we use that data? Sort of like hit a new level of examination as we prep for the new school year. We really, I think, benefit a lot from a tremendous amount of trust that our team has built with stakeholders across Louisiana, from the lead agencies that conduct local observations, the PCARD Center, site directors, the Department of Health, really like a variety of stakeholders. And throughout the summer, we frequently found ourselves working with them to think through these two big questions. And everything that sort of came up in our conversations this summer focused on these two questions, right? Can we conduct and collect class data this year? And sort of like, if we're able to, then how does it make sense to use that data to support our critical goals? I think that during the course of the summer, we probably spent a lot more time on that first set of questions. And I think that this really came to a head in preparing for the fall 2020 local observation protocols. To paint a little bit of a picture, this is typically a 13-page document in 12-point font, and this year it turned into a 21-page document in 10-point font, and was really like the result of a tremendous amount of work by folks on our team, captained by Amy Poirier, who just really like brought together all of the stakeholders to think through, what are the considerations for conducting in-person class observations? When does it make sense to attempt them? What additional precautions need to be taken? What things like shadow scoring just didn't make sense to do this year because, for example, shadow scoring would require a pretty large number of adults to children in a classroom and would come into conflict with some of the reopening guidelines. And I think I could probably spend much more than the remaining time of this webinar going through each of the sort of components of the fall observation protocols, but this is publicly available on our website, and when you receive the deck for this presentation, there's a link in there. And so I'm not going to belabor each of the sort of decision points here, but want to paint a picture that we really had to examine everything about our typical protocols. In a normal year, we would have published just the first two columns of the table that you see in front of you. And this year, we had to add a COVID-19 flavor to in-person observations for each of the local protocol requirements. But one of the things that we did this year that we'd never done before is provide a series of best practices and guidance around virtual observations. A lot of our lead agencies communicated to us that this was an exciting opportunity, or an opportunity to sort of begin looking at virtual observations and explore how those could work and how those could look. And so we began publishing some best practices around what those could look like, and simultaneously began a pilot with the PCARD Center for sites to opt into receiving virtual third-party observations, so that we could learn really quickly what those observations would look like, and what maybe version 2 of this guidance would need to look like around virtual observations as we sort of thought through the rest of this year. In addition to the guidance that we published, we also provided a tremendous amount of support to the field. I think it's not at all surprising to learn that this, all of our conversations with the field indicated the thing that we already knew, right? Which was that COVID-19 presented a pretty unprecedented opportunity, and to rise to that occasion, we really needed to position teachers and the folks who support teachers with a lot of additional supports. And so some of those included increasing lead agency allocations. The amount of money we provide to community network lead agencies to conduct observations increased. We provided financial support directly to childcare providers to cover costs associated with operations, including things like observations. We expanded partnerships with organizations like the Tulane Early Childhood Mental Health Consultation Program that provided coaching and support both to kids and to educators, but also some trauma-informed classroom practices. And I think if we haven't said guidance enough, I think it's worth double-clicking here that we continued to hear about the need for more clarity on how to conduct observations in situations where teachers might be wearing a mask, or children might be attempting to distance, or a variety, or like sanitation, like sanitizing things made classrooms look really differently than the classrooms that we all got our observer reliability training on. And so this combination, I don't think is a comprehensive picture, but I think it's really important to underscore that all of the guidance we were providing really came alongside a support to help folks, to help folks implement that guidance. As a result of, at the end of the fall semester, we received observation results, and we're able to sort of take a look at trends, and we're really excited to see the trends of incremental growth over time continuing. And I think that this really, like under this data are two really important stories that the bar graph itself doesn't tell, right? One is the Herculean work that teachers were doing in Louisiana to make sure that despite all the instability outside of classroom walls, that within their classrooms, kids were experiencing constantly improving interactions that continue to set them up for success. And I also think that under this data, there's a real story about the tenacity and the grace and the perseverance and the patience that lead agencies combined in this like really magical way this year to navigate observations in a new time. And I think there are a number of anecdotes, but I think a lot about St. Charles Parish, where they made a shift almost completely to virtual in the fall, and the way that throughout that process, the lead agency there really broke each of the components of the transition into smaller, sort of more manageable pieces for sites and for teachers, and provided a ton of support at each step to make sure that that transition really felt positive. And I think that each community network has a story like that of a thing they had to do differently this year in meeting the typical observation requirements. And I think that this graph doesn't quite tell that story, but it's important to note. That's not to say that the fall observation was perfect. The fall observation period was perfect. I think we had a lot of things that we iterated on and learned about throughout the fall. And that led us to another sort of set of decisions, sort of like mid-fall into winter. And I'm going to let Farishay sort of talk us through those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bach. I appreciate it. So as we went into winter, we came to a couple critical points. One is that similar to much of the nation, we did experience a COVID spike over the winter of 2020, and which resulted in the need to pause in-person observations by external observers. And then the other thing in terms of how we used class data is in a normal year, we receive a lot more observations than we're able to during a COVID year. And so as a result, we had to make some changes to that use. So just kind of going through some of those big decision points. First of all, we approved classroom level waivers. As we spoke about earlier, we rely heavily on that observation coverage that is in every classroom that is publicly funded in this state, but classrooms were meeting virtually, needing to quarantine. There were challenges associated with tech, with having enough PPE. And so we ended up receiving over 600 classroom level waivers. And just for context, normally we receive fewer than 10 within a semester for classrooms that were unable to be observed. And then also, again, as the result of the spread of COVID, we experienced a spike over the winter. And so in consultation with the Louisiana Department of Health, we paused in-person observations and shifted exclusively to virtual third-party observations for the first time ever. Let me tell you, we were very glad we had done that pilot when it had to come about to keep our communities safer. And then to align with the flexibility that K-12 was already having around accountability, our Board of Elementary and Secondary Education approved a one-time emergency rule. And so our classrooms that were scoring proficient or higher on the class tool only had to receive one local observation instead of the customary two for this school year. And again, this was all possible because of our deep engagement with our lead agencies, with our directors, with the Department of Health. We were able to respond swiftly as challenges emerged and new conditions cropped up, there were people who were willing to give generous feedback and who were willing to iterate with us so we could do what was best for our kids and for our community, navigating those two tensions of when to collect class data and how, as well as what to do with that data once it's been collected. So I did want to briefly pause and show just what kind of impact the pandemic had on our normal observation coverage for comparison. We had a reduction of classrooms, as you can see, and then much fewer local observations, far fewer third-party observations than we typically have. Again, with COVID, it became very difficult sometimes to coordinate and schedule observations in order to navigate those health challenges. And we just continued, it's a tightrope that you walk in between. We want to do what's best for kids, and we know high quality interactions are best for kids. And we also want to do what's best for kids because we know that we need to take this pandemic and our community health seriously. So having covered some of those impacts on COVID-19 and some of the decision points we faced in the winter, looking forward to the spring of 2021, I'll go ahead and pass it back to my colleague, Michael Bach, to talk about what we've been doing this semester.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think that as over the course of this semester, we've continued to focus on questions in the more logistical bucket, right? How do we collect class data to support our goals? And I think the biggest iteration here this semester has been that we've been able to publish some guidance along with the Department of Health for in-person observations by vaccinated observers that feels like it's beginning to edge us closer and closer back to a typical year. But I think that the real story in this spring is that we've been able to also shift our focus more to the second question of exactly how do we use the class data collected this year to support our goals. Over the beginning, probably in December and January, we began sort of circulating a series of potential proposals for accountability this year with a variety of stakeholders, lead agencies, site directors, really anyone that we could find that new class, new sites, new kids. We wanted to get their take on our proposals for accountability this year. And this has sort of led us to a set of recommendations that's been endorsed by a broad set of stakeholders on the Early Childhood Education and Care Advisory Committee in Louisiana, which includes site directors, lead agency representatives, state policymakers, and others. And this set of recommendations is up for consideration by our State Board of Education, which is Bessie in Louisiana, later this month. And so I want to just sort of caveat that a lot of these are proposed revisions that will be considered later this month. But our current proposals include, to Bessie, include using the class data from this year and the performance profiles that we typically publish to recognize growth by updating performance profiles for sites that have higher observation scores from 2020, 2021. And extending performance ratings for other sites to ensure that sites don't feel a penalty as a result of that focus on quality during COVID-19. We are going to use the data collected during 2020, 2021 to target the supports that we typically provide for sites, including SIP, so that we are using sort of the most recent indicators for sites, given that those sort of lead to really personalized and site-specific action plans that can help target the steps needed to make sure that kids continue to get high quality interactions across the state. And finally, I think we've continued to recognize that participating in accountability and focusing on the focus on quality that's associated with participating in accountability has really put a lot of has required a lot from sites across the state. And so moving forward, we're providing some funding and through a grant opportunity to support Type 3 sites, as well as Head Start and childcare sites, to offset the costs that were associated with observations during the past year, because sites have had to do everything ranging from additional sort of administrative capacity to communicate with observers, to having site designees sort of man the camera in the cases where we've employed virtual observations. I think that this is sort of a broad set of things that are sort of our most recent action steps, but I think we're continuing to stay in touch with the field about things that are that feel really high priority in order to maintain a focus on quality moving forward, and to talk about a few of the things that are sort of on the horizon. I'm going to pass back to Taylor.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to round us out and just talk a little bit about where we go from here. So most of the critical decisions around accountability, how to continue to collect class data during a pandemic, and how then do we use class data once we've collected it. Most of those key decisions have been made, but we are continuing to work with our Office of Public Health and Department of Health to continue to publish updates and monitor closely so that we know when we can signal to the field a return to normalcy, when and if that ever happens. And we're also going to do a deep dive into the data that was collected this year and is being collected this year, with a particular focus on observations conducted virtually through our live remote. We've leveraged Zoom and really try to understand what that data looks like, how different is that data from observation data captured in in-person observations. And so some of the things we'll focus on the next slide. In the next couple of months, we want to use this opportunity to better understand virtual observation. So for years, we've had conversations with stakeholders about the role that video-based or live virtual observations could play in our accountability system. And we've never fully figured it out. And we really want to capitalize on the fact that we're using live virtual observations right now to learn about how these work, how does the data look. We're considering a pilot of some double coding when one observer is in the classroom and one observer is live and remote on Zoom, to understand what those disparities in scoring looks like and how we can, think about using virtual observations as part of our accountability system moving forward. And then also some of the things we're focused on that I'm sure all of you are as well is around thinking about how do we support early childhood transitions this year. We've seen a significant drop in pre-K enrollment and childcare and Head Start enrollment over this year. And even within those groups of children that have been enrolled in early childhood, shifts from fully virtual to closures to hybrid back to in-person. And so we know that kids are going to be entering schools and centers and Head Starts in the fall, having had a very atypical year this year. So thinking about how do we support those transitions and get educators and site administrators tools to support kids entering programs this summer and fall. And last, we're going to continue to focus on how do we expand access to high quality early learning experiences. So, we have a really robust focus on quality and rely heavily on the class tool, but we know that far too few children can access high quality classrooms. So we'll continue to think about how we can use this moment and stimulus funding to expand access to early childhood in the coming years. Next slide. And so to ground us again and just, the beliefs that have really guided our decision making over the course of the last year. One, we have really wanted a focus on health and safety. This is a pandemic, and so we wanted the health and safety of children, teachers, directors, and observers to take center stage. But we also wanted to ensure that the interactions that were occurring between children and adults in classrooms continue to be captured and continue to matter. And as a result, we have really relied on creative solutions. We've relied on the data that we've collected in our accountability system. We've relied on engagement with our stakeholders to make these decisions. And I believe that is all the content we have. So now we're happy to pause for any questions or discussion.
Great, thank you guys so much. There are a number of questions, and I am going to make sure I can pop them out so I can see them all fully here. There were a couple of just questions about your community networks, what makes up a community network, how you figured out how you do your composite class scores. So if you could just maybe talk about that briefly.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about community networks, and then Bach, maybe you can talk about the composite class scores. So we have parishes in Louisiana, so we don't have counties, but we have parishes. There's 65 parishes in Louisiana, I believe, don't quote me, maybe 64. And we have one community network essentially for every parish. In some cases, it's a city that is its own early childhood community network. In some cases, it's two parishes that have joined together to be one composite community network. We run an application process for these community network lead agencies every 2 years. So we open up a competitive process for organizations to apply to be the lead agency for the community network. And it's typically, in almost all of the cases in our state, it's typically the school system that functions as the lead agency that coordinates the early childhood work. But in some cases, it's a nonprofit. Sometimes it's a child care resource and referral agency that plays that role. And really what the lead agencies in the community network is charged with is coordinating all of the early childhood work locally. So that involves all of the various different program types in Louisiana, child care centers that receive CCDF subsidy, Head Starts and early Head Starts, and state pre-K programs that are offered both in public schools and non-public schools in Louisiana. The lead agency for the community network coordinates all of the funding that is allocated to them through the state, as well as coordinating class observations and coordinating enrollment across all three of those program types. So that is sort of the structure of our community network model. Cedra, anything you would add or probe me on there?
No, I don't think so. I think that's good.
Okay, great.
Cool. In terms of how we roll up class observations into a performance score, I'm in my head navigating this tension because I love to nerd out about this and could probably get so wonky and in the weeds about this that I would probably bore a lot of folks. And so I'm going to try really hard to be super concise here, but just also want to mention that if you're the sort of person that wants to really nerd out about this, I think my email address is on the screen, and I am more than happy to set up some time to like nerd out about these things sort of one-on-one. Sort of broadly, we roll up the dimension level results from all of the observations conducted at a site over the course of a year. And so this will include one observation in the fall by the local lead agency, one observation in the spring by the local lead agency. And then these, we have a variety of ways of checking these scores with like third-party observations that can play a role in shaping the performance scores for some sites. But I think that without getting too in the weeds about all of that, I think I'll just say that we have, that very broadly, it's a roll-up of dimension level scores from all of the local observations conducted at a site, with then a few caveats for when checks indicate that there are some disparities between what local observers are reporting and what the third-party observers are seeing.
Great, thank you. There are also some questions asking for clarification on shadow coding and what that means and what that looks like.
Yeah, the shadow score, I think that there's like a few different same words that mean the same, different words that mean the same thing here. I think we refer to shadow scoring a lot in the same way that I think it really means the same thing as double scoring, right? This is when two class reliable observers observe a classroom and then compare scores in order to ensure inter-rater reliability, so that we know that the observers conducting class observations are sort of synced and reliable to each other and to the class tool. And I think that while all of our observers must maintain class reliability, we do shadow scoring, double coding, as well as require local observers to participate in calibration activities as a few ways to sort of like up the expectations for observers reliability beyond just being class reliable, given the stakes that come with accountability and the class observations in Louisiana. We want to make sure that teachers are getting the right feedback and cannot, and I think do ask observers to do a lot of things like shadow scoring, double coding, and calibration activities beyond just class reliability to make sure that feedback is what's most useful for teachers to inform growth. kids.
Great, thank you. There are also several questions asking kind of specifically how you did the virtual observations, whether you had to get permissions from parents to do the virtual observations, like what did that look like? Was somebody live in the classroom? Or if you could just describe a little more around that.
Yeah, I think the answer is that it looked really different in a lot of different places. And what might be really useful is to provide a bit of a picture of the range of things that were occurring versus just saying like, this is the one way it happened. This obviously was the first year we did it. And I think we really treated this as a year of prototyping, iterating, getting better and better at understanding how developing best practices around this. But I think it looked really different in different places. There were some community networks where like a school system, for example, had such strict privacy laws that said like we cannot like Zoom in a classroom, we cannot record a classroom, and that just wasn't an option in that place. In other places, there were restrictions on things like recording, but not on like a FaceTime or a Zoom, and so we could use a platform like FaceTime or Zoom. In some places, internet capacity was really a challenge, and so rather than do it over sort of like a live feed like we're doing right now, this meant that like an observation was recorded and like saved on a device and then like physically transferred. I don't know if it was like on a jump drive or like what. It certainly wasn't a floppy disk, but I'm not quite sure what like what the version now is. But these recordings were physically transferred to another device to view and decode, because I think that we don't benefit from universal broadband access in Louisiana, and internet capacity has been a challenge in some places. In some places, there was somebody that came in and provided, sort of filming for the class observation. And I think this was really a best practice that we really encouraged. And when possible, to have that person be someone who is class reliable so that they know how to navigate the interactions happening in the room. That was really a best practice that evolved over this year. I also think that there are, some networks experimented with new technologies, like Swivel, I think, was one that lots of folks experimented with. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to name drop brands on this webinar or not, so I'll stop there. But like, I think that, this was, I think we really opened, our guidance around local observations is really more around a bare minimum best practices versus a very prescriptive way to complete virtual observations. And I think that we, are still wrapping our heads around all of the different sort of like ideas that flourished under that and understanding those observations.
And another question related to were you noticing a change in class scores based on doing them virtually?
Yeah, I think that we are still really interested in understanding the answer to this question. And I think if you're somebody that like is really interested in also understanding the answer to this question, I encourage you to like reach out. I think that we, have certainly seen some trends that, and the trends of incremental growth in the fall, I think were consistent with previous trends. But I think that our, the work we're hoping to do with the remainder of this year around double scoring classrooms with both a virtual and an in-person score is our like best guess at like the next step we need to take to better understand how these scores compare. And I think it's, and I hesitate to like offer a definitive like yes or no beyond that right now, right? And I think that because of, that's one of the many reasons why I think we've thought that the flexibilities around performance scores and some of the stakes and accountability this year make a lot of sense.
There are a couple other questions related to what age level classrooms were observed, and if family child care was a part of that.
I can jump in a little bit. So we tried to get this year to as many classrooms as possible through various formats, using virtual observations, in-person observations when it made sense, etc. And so what that looks like for the bulk of our quality rating system is infant, toddler, and pre-K classrooms in licensed childcare centers, Head Start centers, and school-based pre-K programs. We also have a pilot of family childcare accountability. Essentially, it's a pilot to test some family childcare networks in Louisiana and what sort of quality measurements and supports we can use to better incorporate family childcare into our more unified strategy. So we did capture some class observations in a small number of family childcare settings, about 60 family childcare provider homes. We did capture class observations this year, but those are more informal and do not contribute to our accountability system.
Okay, and then I hope we'll have time for this last question. Is there any data around the race and ethnicity of the students who are being served in high performing programs versus lower performing programs?
I think that as we think through how we continue to push ourselves on class observations and using classes through an equity lens, I think that this is something that we are getting better and better at, right? And so for the first time, our ability to collect data is through a process called child count, which is sort of like a census of publicly funded children, essentially, each October and February. And I think we have begun piloting and including demographic information for the first time this year, which I think is a really important step to adding to understanding that and operating through with a greater sort of focus on equity this year. But I think that I think we have some preliminary things to share there. But I also think that this was our first year collecting this data, and I'm always very hesitant to share an incomplete picture. And so happy to happy to talk through sort of the preliminary things that we found here. But I'm also really hesitant to just sort of share that too conclusively, because I think that that's a thing that we expect to get better and better and better at over the course of the next year, hopefully, because I think it is really important that very quickly we get really good at being able to speak to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone was asking whether you think there'll be virtual observations still in the 21-22 school year, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think I'm hesitant to I think I'm really eager. We haven't gotten a chance yet as a state to sit down with all of our stakeholders, right, and say what were the big wins, what were the biggest lessons learned this year, what do we keep, what do we take? And I think we've certainly had conversations internally where everything's on the table, and I think we are really open to looking at the things that have happened this year and seeing if it makes sense. But I think one of the core beliefs that has guided all of our decision making what is around engaging stakeholders and understanding what's best for how we best serve the folks who serve kids. And I think until we do that, it feels really premature to say exactly what exactly how what from this year carries into next year and what from this year doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. And just, I know this is unfair to do with 30 seconds left, but people were curious about the improvement plans, and then just how you feel the instructional support domain, particularly, how have you improved that, through coaching and others? If you could just maybe make a quick statement.
Sure, I can jump in and do that. So as we talked about earlier, we mandate site improvement planning for the lowest performing sites in the state. Right now, the policy mandates it for any site that scores below 3.75 on their overall class score. So really the very lowest performing sites in our state. And that site improvement planning process, the way that looks is we assign a field support consultant who is an LDOE employee to essentially have a caseload of these site improvement planning sites. They work with the site in partnership with the Child Care Resource and Referral Agency for the region that the site is located in to develop a year-long site improvement plan and to sketch out goals and sort of benchmarks to achieve the goals in that year-long plan. And that has a real focus on coaching, on interactions, on curriculum use and implementation. So it looks a little different depending on the site, because there's a needs assessment that's done with the site director, a self-assessment, and sometimes it's really focused on business supports and making sure that health and safety is in place in childcare centers. And sometimes it has a much more targeted focus on coaching and interactions, but that is sort of how that looks.
Great. Well, we are at time. Thank you all so much for what you've done. It's been amazing. We've had lots of great comments and questions, and I hope people will copy down your email addresses and take advantage of your offer to have further conversations. Thank you all so much for attending.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Sandra.
Thanks, everybody.